On a quiet evening at one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, billionaire businessman Jonathan Harrison sat at a corner table, his sharp suit and cold demeanor standing in stark contrast to the warmth of the bustling room around him. The lights above shimmered softly, casting long shadows over his stern face as he pored over financial reports, his mind miles away from the world that surrounded him. Despite the opulence of the venue, the clink of silverware, and the laughter of other diners, Jonathan felt an emptiness that no amount of wealth or success could fill. His life, built on cold numbers and even colder decisions, had left him isolated, with few true connections beyond the transactions he oversaw. As he scrolled through his phone, his attention barely lifted to acknowledge the woman who approached his table. Sarah, a black waitress in her mid-30s, had seen her fair share of entitled patrons and dismissive businessmen, but something about Jonathan's presence struck her differently. She didn't know his name or his wealth, only that he was a man who carried a weight in his eyes that mirrored the exhaustion she often felt in her own heart. After handing him the menu, she politely asked if he was ready to order, but Jonathan barely looked up, his mind still tangled in thoughts of the deals that weren't going the way he'd hoped. He waved her off with a distracted "just bring me something," his tone as curt as the cold wind that whipped through the city streets outside. Sarah nodded and went to the kitchen, but as she prepared his meal, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was something more to this man than the cold, aloof exterior he presented. She knew that behind every surface, there were untold stories, struggles, and emotions, something that even the wealthiest could not escape. As she placed the carefully prepared dish in front of Jonathan, she noticed him staring blankly at his phone, his face tight with stress. His lips were pursed, and for a moment, she could see the faintest flicker of frustration in his eyes. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed a small piece of paper and scribbled something quickly on it before folding it neatly. As she leaned down to deliver the dish, she slid the folded note discreetly onto his table. "I hope today is the day you find peace," the note read, simple words written in neat handwriting. She wasn't sure why she had written it, nor why she had felt compelled to leave it for him, but it felt like something he needed to hear, words that had nothing to do with business or success, but with human connection. Jonathan, initially oblivious to the note, only noticed it after Sarah walked away. He stared at the small piece of paper for a long moment, its simplicity a stark contrast to the complexities of his life. His eyes narrowed as he unfolded it and read the words. For a brief second, the weight of his ambition and the constant pressure of his work seemed to melt away. It wasn't the kind of advice he was used to receiving, no talk of mergers, no strategies for growing his empire, just a simple wish for peace. Jonathan couldn't help but wonder what kind of person would leave such a thing for a stranger, and why it resonated so deeply with him. His thoughts wandered, drifting from his business empire to the moments he had lost, the relationships he had neglected, and the hollow loneliness that success had brought him. There was a silence in the restaurant, but to Jonathan, it felt like everything had paused for just that moment. He thought of his family, whom he had drifted away from over the years, of the friends he had stopped seeing because they were no longer useful. He thought of the faces he'd passed without a second glance, the countless employees, like Sarah, who lived lives just as full of struggle and beauty as his own, but whom he had never truly seen. After a long, silent moment, Jonathan finally looked up, his eyes softening, and for the first time in a long while, he really saw Sarah. Her face, still etched with the traces of her own quiet strength, reflected a vulnerability that matched his own. As he met her gaze, there was no judgment, no expectation, just an understanding that they were both people, caught in the current of a world that often asked too much and gave too little. His throat tightened, and he realized that the simple note had changed something in him. It had cracked open the hardened shell he had so carefully built around himself, reminding him that true peace wasn't something to be bought or achieved. It was something to be felt, something to be shared. As he left the restaurant later that night, Jonathan didn't just carry the weight of his business or his empire, he carried a quiet sense of gratitude. He had made his fortune by seeing everything as a transaction, but that evening, for the first time, he had received something truly priceless. A small gesture from a woman whose life, from the outside, seemed so different from his own, had reminded him that the greatest thing a person can do is offer kindness without expecting anything in return. Sarah, meanwhile, went on with her shift, unaware that her simple note had reached a man who had needed it more than she could ever have known. As she moved through the night, delivering meals and clearing tables, she carried with her the knowledge that, sometimes, it's not the grand gestures that change the world, but the quiet, unassuming acts of humanity that resonate the longest. Sophie had always kept her head down and her mouth shut, knowing her place as a waitress in the upscale cafe that catered to the city's elite. For years, she had served coffee to the wealthy, smiled politely at their conversations, and endured their dismissive glances as they talked over her, unaware of her presence. She had learned early on that in the world of the rich, people like her were invisible, nothing more than a cog in the machine. She had grown accustomed to the way they looked at her as if she were nothing more than a shadow, a figure meant to serve without question or complaint. Among her regular customers was Nathaniel West, a billionaire known not only for his vast fortune but also for his arrogance and sense of superiority. He was the epitome of everything Sophie resented about the world. His wealth allowed him to control and manipulate, to walk through life like the rules didn't apply to him. Sophie had never liked him. The way he threw his money around, the casual way he spoke down to the staff, the entitled smile that always seemed to linger on his lips, it all rubbed her the wrong way. She had witnessed him belittle other workers, from the chef in the back to the busboys who cleaned the tables, and every time, her heart ached. She would catch herself fuming in silence, feeling the injustice burn in her chest. But she never said anything. She never could. She was just a waitress. But one afternoon, as fate would have it, Sophie found herself standing at Nathaniel's table once again, her notepad in hand, ready to take his order. He was seated with a group of other powerful businessmen, talking about mergers and acquisitions, their voices low and conspiratorial. Sophie approached, offering her usual polite smile, but this time, something in her snapped. Nathaniel didn't even look up at her, too busy with his conversation to acknowledge her presence. His tone was dismissive as he glanced at the menu. "Just bring me my usual," he muttered without a second thought, as though she was nothing more than a servant. It was a moment that could have easily passed by unnoticed, but for Sophie, it felt like a tipping point. She stood still for a moment, the weight of the moment settling in her chest. She had been treated like this too many times before. Something inside her rose, and for the first time, she didn't feel small. "You know," she said, her voice unexpectedly steady, "I think you might want to try something different today." The table fell silent. Nathaniel looked up at her with a raised eyebrow, his expression a mixture of surprise and disdain. "Excuse me," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Sophie's heart was pounding in her chest, but she wasn't backing down now. "I've been serving you for months, Mr. West. And I've noticed that you always order the same thing, always the same routine." She took a breath, looking him squarely in the eye. "You talk about mergers and power and all these grand plans, but you don't seem to realize that you've been living your life on autopilot. Maybe it's time to change things up, See if there's something better out there. The room was still. Nathaniel stared at her, disbelief and anger flashing across his face. The other businessmen at the table exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to make of this bold interruption. For a moment, Sophie feared she had gone too far, that this would be the end of her job. But to her surprise, Nathaniel didn't fire her. Instead, he looked around at his colleagues, who were now watching the exchange with rapt attention. The arrogance slowly drained from his face as he regarded her. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice lower than usual, as if genuinely considering her words for the first time. The shift in his tone was subtle, but it was there, a crack in the armor he had built around himself. For a long moment, Sophie stood there, unsure of what would come next. The power dynamic had shifted, and for the first time in this cafe, she felt seen. After a pause, Nathaniel looked up at her, this time with a faint smile, not the smug, entitled one he usually wore, but one of genuine curiosity. "All right," he said, "bring me something different. Surprise me." Sophie nodded, still feeling a bit out of breath, but she didn't allow herself to show weakness. She turned to walk away, but not before glancing back at the table one last time. Nathaniel's eyes followed her as she moved through the cafe, and for the first time, he wasn't just watching her as a server. He was watching her as a person. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur for Sophie. She couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. Had she really just challenged a billionaire, a man who could have her fired with a single word? Had she really stood up to him and won? When she returned to his table with his new order, something had shifted. Nathaniel was different now, not just because he had agreed to let her surprise him, but because he had been forced to confront his own actions. His interactions with the rest of the staff that day were different, more respectful. And in the weeks that followed, Sophie noticed subtle changes in him, a softer tone, a moment of appreciation for those who worked under him. He had never said it out loud, but it was clear that her quiet act of rebellion had left an impact. Sophie had stopped him in his tracks, not with force or confrontation, but with a single, bold decision to speak her truth. She had reminded him that there was more to life than power and wealth, and that true strength came from recognizing the humanity in everyone. In that simple act of defiance, Sophie had won something far more valuable than any tip or praise. She had found her voice, and in doing so, she had forced a man who thought he was untouchable to see the world through her eyes. The world knew Lucas Montgomery as one of the richest and most powerful men in the country. A self-made billionaire, he had climbed his way to the top with sharp intellect, ruthless business strategies, and an unyielding drive. But despite all his success, Lucas felt emptier with each passing day. His fortune, his fame, and his lavish lifestyle seemed to have no meaning, leaving him constantly searching for something he couldn't quite define. On an ordinary Tuesday, tired from another long, soul-sucking day at work, Lucas found himself in a small, unassuming diner on the outskirts of town, a rare break from his usual high-end restaurants and private chefs. He wanted to be away from the world that constantly demanded his attention, even if just for a moment. The diner was nothing special, with faded booths, flickering lights, and the hum of idle chatter. The waitress, Claire, was young, barely in her 20s, with a warmth in her smile that seemed out of place in the sterile, fast-paced world Lucas was accustomed to. She approached his table, her notepad in hand, and without missing a beat, asked him what he'd like to order. Lucas didn't expect much from the interaction. He was just another anonymous face to her, another customer passing through. His life, filled with meetings and cold transactions, had become a blur of faces with no real connection. As Claire served him his meal, their exchange was brief, no more than a few pleasantries. Yet something about her quiet demeanor, her genuine interest in his well-being despite his apparent disinterest, struck a chord within him. He wasn't used to people treating him like a human being and not a commodity. He ate in silence, lost in his thoughts, as the minutes ticked by. But just before he left, as Claire handed him the check, something unexpected happened. Beneath the total, written in neat, careful handwriting, was a note: "Your worth isn't measured by what you own, but by the lives you touch. Hope you find your peace, Lucas." The words seemed to stop time. Lucas stared at the note, his eyes fixed on the simple message that, in its understated way, shattered the walls he had spent years building around himself. He wasn't sure why, but the words resonated deep within him. They were so different from the boardroom speeches, the strategic deals, and the calculated numbers that governed his every waking moment. This wasn't a business proposition or a critique, it was a reminder that, somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of what truly mattered. Lucas had spent so much time measuring his success by the accumulation of wealth and influence, but here was a woman who, with a few words, had given him a glimpse of something far more valuable: humanity, kindness, and connection. He had become so consumed by his empire, so focused on climbing higher and higher, that he had neglected the very things that made life worth living. That night, as Lucas lay awake in his luxurious penthouse, the words from Claire's note continued to echo in his mind. He thought about all the people he had passed by, all the relationships he had neglected, all the times he had chosen profits over people. The emptiness he had been trying to fill with success was only deepening. He realized that for all his accomplishments, he was more alone than ever. The next morning, Lucas woke up with a strange sense of clarity. He had no idea why the note had affected him so deeply, but he knew one thing: he couldn't continue down this path. He couldn't spend his life pursuing goals that didn't bring him happiness or fulfillment. He needed to change. He began with small steps, reaching out to people he had ignored for years: old friends, family members, colleagues. He started making time for things he had once loved but had let fall by the wayside: hiking in the mountains, reading books that didn't involve business, and simply sitting in the park, watching the world around him. Slowly but surely, Lucas found himself shedding the heavy weight of his success-driven life. He started giving back, supporting causes that mattered to him, using his wealth to help others rather than hoarding it for himself. But more importantly, he focused on people: real, meaningful connections. Over the next few months, he reconnected with Claire, the waitress whose words had sparked a change in his life. He made a point to visit the diner often, not for the food, but to see her, to thank her for reminding him of the value of kindness, of compassion. One evening, as he sat across from her in the same booth where it all began, he told her, "You changed my life." She smiled, shrugging it off as if it was nothing. "I just wrote what I felt," she said. But to Lucas, those words had been the turning point: the moment he stopped measuring his life by the wealth he had accumulated and started living it with a new sense of purpose. In the years that followed, Lucas's transformation was evident to everyone who knew him. He became a philanthropist, a mentor, and a friend to those who needed him most. The walls he had built around his heart began to crumble, and in their place, something far more meaningful grew: a deep, unshakable peace. And all of it started with a waitress's simple note, written in the quiet of a diner, to a man who had forgotten that the true measure of success is not in what you have, but in how you make others feel. In a bustling city, where the glint of luxury and the hum of everyday struggle often danced side by side, there worked a woman named Simone, a black waitress who, despite her humble position, carried an undeniable strength in her heart and a quiet dream that never left her side. Simone's life had always been one of service. She had spent years waiting tables at a high-end restaurant, where the wealth and power of her customers were as visible as the polished floors beneath her feet. Yet, beneath the surface, there was a fierceness in Simone that most people couldn't see, an ambition not to simply serve, but to one day elevate herself, her family, and her community. She had dreams of becoming a writer, of telling stories that mattered, stories that reflected the lives of people like her, lives often overlooked by the world. But, for now, she poured coffee and took orders, smiling through the exhaustion, her dreams kept alive in the quiet corners of her mind. One evening, a regular customer entered the restaurant, a billionaire businessman named Victor Shaw, whose name was as synonymous with wealth as it was with influence. Victor had a reputation for being aloof and distant, a man who walked through life with the air of someone who had everything and nothing all at once. His visits to the restaurant were often brief, his interactions curt, and his face rarely softened by anything resembling warmth. Simone had seen him often enough to recognize his stern demeanor, but unlike the others, she didn't see just a man in a suit. She saw someone who, like her, carried burdens, someone who had likely sacrificed more than he'd ever allowed anyone to know. One evening, as she approached his table to take his order, she noticed something different. Victor wasn't absorbed in his usual thoughts or business calls. Instead, he seemed distracted, almost withdrawn, his eyes flickering with an emotion Simone couldn't quite place. The sight stirred something in her, a quiet compassion, a recognition that he, too, was more than the money and power that defined his outward life. As she set down his coffee, she hesitated for a moment, feeling an inexplicable urge to connect with him beyond the usual pleasantries. "Is everything okay, sir?" she asked, her voice gentle but sincere. Victor looked up, surprised, as if he hadn't expected anyone to notice. His lips pressed together for a moment, then he sighed deeply. "It's just, things are complicated, you know," he replied, his voice softening. "I've built an empire, but I feel like I've lost the most important thing, my sense of purpose." Simone stood there, listening, as his words hit her in a way she hadn't expected. She could feel the weight of his loneliness, the disillusionment that so often accompanied success. A part of her wanted to say something comforting, but instead, she simply nodded, acknowledging the truth of his statement. "Sometimes, it's hard to find our way when we're caught up in the noise of it all," she said quietly, offering him a moment of shared understanding. The brief exchange ended with a polite smile, and Simone moved on to the next table, but something inside her lingered. That evening, as she worked the rest of her shift, Simone couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Victor Shaw than his public persona, that there was something raw and real beneath the layers of wealth and status. As she wiped down tables, she thought about her own dreams, her own struggles, and how sometimes the simplest moments of connection, however fleeting, could have the power to change someone's life. As her shift ended, Simone decided to do something she had never done before. She took a small piece of paper, wrote a note to Victor, and left it on his table before she left for the night. The note was simple, yet deeply personal. "I believe that no matter how far we go, we can always find our way back to what truly matters. You don't have to carry the weight of the world alone." Simone, it wasn't a grand gesture, it wasn't meant to be. But it was real. It was a message from one human being to another, offering a kind of hope that transcended their worlds of differences. The next morning, as Simone came in for her shift, she was stunned to find that Victor had left her a note in return, tucked neatly under a coffee cup. It read, Thank you for reminding me that it's okay to feel lost sometimes. You're right, no one should carry the weight of the world alone. I'd like to know more about you and your story. The note, brief yet profound, marked the beginning of an unexpected connection. Over the next few months, Victor and Simone exchanged letters, each one filled with vulnerability, insight, and, surprisingly, a shared sense of purpose. Simone told Victor about her dreams of becoming a writer, of giving voice to the overlooked stories of her community, while Victor opened up about the sacrifices he had made to build his empire, how in the pursuit of wealth, he had lost touch with the very things that had once brought him joy. Eventually, Victor asked Simone to lunch, and what started as a simple exchange of words became the foundation of a friendship that neither of them had anticipated. As they spoke, Simone's honesty and warmth gradually unraveled the walls Victor had spent years building around himself. He began to see her not as a waitress, but as a person who, despite her struggles, had found a way to stay true to herself. In turn, Simone saw in Victor not just a billionaire, but a man who, despite his success, was searching for something deeper, something more meaningful. That lunch turned into many more, and over time, Victor's perception of the world began to shift. Through Simone's unwavering belief in kindness and connection, he rediscovered his own sense of purpose, this time not through wealth, but through the relationships he had neglected and the people he had overlooked. And Simone, with Victor's encouragement and support, finally took the leap to pursue her writing, sharing her stories with the world. It was a note, simple, unexpected, and heartfelt, that had sparked a transformation in both their lives, showing that sometimes the smallest gestures of compassion can change everything. What began as an exchange between a black waitress and a billionaire ultimately became a story of mutual healing, proving that human connection, no matter how unlikely, has the power to rewrite the narrative of anyone's life. Sophia had always prided herself on being a quiet observer, a trait that made her an exceptional waitress at a small cafe in the heart of the city. The cafe wasn't one of those high-end establishments with expensive menus or celebrity patrons. It was a humble, cozy place where people came to escape the chaos of their daily lives and find comfort in a hot cup of coffee or a fresh pastry. Sophia's days were filled with the sounds of clinking dishes, quiet conversations, and the rustle of newspapers, yet she never let the noise of the world distract her from the stories unfolding around her. She had a rare gift for reading people, sensing when someone needed space, when they were lost in thought, or when a simple smile could turn their day around. It was on an ordinary Wednesday morning, with the rain tapping softly against the windows, that a man walked in who would change her life. He was tall, dressed in a tailored suit that cost more than she made in a month, his sharp features giving him an air of power and control. His name was Edward Blackwell, a billionaire who owned a number of global companies, known for his ruthless business deals and cold, impersonal demeanor. Sophia had seen his name in the papers and knew exactly who he was. He was the kind of person whose presence commanded attention, whose wealth seemed boundless, and whose world felt untouchable. But as Edward sat at a corner table, staring out the window with a furrowed brow, there was something about him that seemed out of place. He wasn't his usual confident self. There was a heaviness in his eyes, a deep weariness that even his expensive suit couldn't conceal. It was almost as though he was waiting for something, or perhaps, for someone to fix what was broken inside him. The cafe was quiet, and Sophia, as always, paid attention to the rhythm of the room. She noticed that Edward wasn't reading his usual stack of financial reports or checking his emails. Instead, he was lost in his thoughts, occasionally running a hand through his hair as if trying to push away the weight of 100 unspoken problems. Without thinking, Sophia approached his table with the same quiet grace she offered every customer. She placed the menu in front of him with a soft smile. "Good morning. Can I get you something to start your day?" she asked, her voice calm but warm. Edward barely looked up, his mind clearly elsewhere. He waved a dismissive hand, clearly not interested in the menu. "Just black coffee, please," he muttered, his voice strained and tired. Sophia nodded, sensing that there was more to the situation than a simple request for coffee. As she turned to leave, she noticed that his eyes were still locked on the rain outside, his gaze distant and lost. Something about the moment made her pause. Most people would have let him be, assuming that someone like Edward Blackwell was beyond reach, that his world was too far removed from theirs to understand. But Sophia's heart told her otherwise. She had seen that same look of exhaustion in people before, a look that spoke not of wealth or success, but of something much deeper, something more human. As she returned with his coffee, she placed the cup gently on the table and sat down across from him without asking, her intuition guiding her actions. Edward looked up in surprise, his brow furrowing slightly. "Excuse me," but he started, his tone clearly irritated. But Sophia didn't give him a chance to finish. "I know you're not interested in small talk," she said, her voice steady, "but I think you need a moment of silence." The words hung in the air, unexpected and bold. Edward blinked, taken aback by her audacity. No one spoke to him like that, especially not in his own city. He was accustomed to power, to being in control of every situation. But here, in this small cafe with a stranger, something about her presence was different. It wasn't that she was defying him, it was that she wasn't afraid of him. Sophia's quiet understanding settled around him like a soft blanket, wrapping him in a silence that was both comforting and unsettling. "You've been carrying something heavy for a long time," she continued, her words cutting through the tension. "I can see it in the way you're holding yourself. But right now, I'm asking you to stop and breathe for a moment. Just a moment. It's okay to put the world down, even if only for a minute." Edward's jaw tightened, and for the first time in a long while, he felt vulnerable. His walls, built so high and strong, began to crack. He stared at her, not knowing what to say, as she simply sat there, her eyes kind but unwavering. She wasn't asking for anything from him, and yet, her presence was demanding something he hadn't realized he needed, a break from the constant noise of his life. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but silence between them. The rain continued to fall outside, the sound of droplets against the glass creating a soft rhythm that was oddly soothing. Edward had been taught to run from his emotions, to bury them beneath layers of work and ambition, but now, with Sophia's calm gaze fixed on him, he realized he couldn't outrun what he had been hiding for so long. He inhaled deeply, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like years. And when he finally spoke, his voice was softer than it had been all morning. "I don't know how to stop," he said quietly, almost to himself. Sophia simply nodded. "That's okay. You don't have to know. Sometimes, all we need is someone who doesn't ask us to be anything other than what we are in the moment." The words sank into Edward's heart like a quiet revelation. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel something besides the relentless drive for success. And in that moment of silence, he knew his life had changed forever. It was a Wednesday morning like any other when Ethan Hayes, a reclusive billionaire known for his sharp mind and unapproachable demeanor, walked into the modest diner on the corner of Main Street. He was used to luxurious restaurants with five-star chefs and meticulously tailored service, but today, his assistant had convinced him to try something different, a quiet, unassuming spot where no one would bother him. He wasn't interested in the food or the ambience, but in the solitude. As he sat at the counter, a waitress named Clara, a woman in her late 20s with a calm, unassuming presence, approached him with a warm smile. Her uniform was simple, but there was an undeniable grace in the way she carried herself, a quiet confidence that contrasted sharply with the bustling chaos of the diner around her. Clara had worked at the diner for years, never dreaming of fame or fortune. Her life had been one of hard work and perseverance, not of high-powered deals or boardroom meetings. She had learned to listen, to observe, and to offer comfort in the small moments, as she knew that sometimes the greatest impact came not from grand gestures, but from the simple, everyday acts of kindness. Ethan barely acknowledged her as she took his order, his mind preoccupied with the next big business move, the endless pressure to maintain his empire, and the weight of his own solitude. He had been a billionaire for years, but success had come at a high cost. He had no friends, no real connections, and the deeper he sank into the world of high finance, the more isolated he became. His life was a fortress of glass and steel, and the people who tried to break through only seemed to want something from him. Clara, however, had no such intentions. As she delivered his coffee and scrambled eggs, she noticed the weariness in his eyes, the subtle signs of someone who had long ago stopped living for himself and had become consumed by the expectations of others. Unlike the other customers who either avoided eye contact or tried to engage him with small talk, Clara simply said, "I hope you enjoy your breakfast. If you need anything, I'll be right here." It wasn't a statement made out of politeness or a sales pitch, it was genuine, and it was enough to make Ethan pause for a moment. For the first time in a long while, someone had spoken to him not because of who he was, but simply because she cared about doing her job well. Throughout the morning, as Ethan sipped his coffee and stared out the window, he couldn't help but notice Clara again and again, how she moved through the diner with an effortless calm, checking on each customer with a quiet attentiveness, never rushing, never hovering. There was no desperation in her movements, no eagerness to please. She simply did her job with dignity and respect for the people around her. It was a stark contrast to the frenetic energy of his world, where every interaction seemed to come with an underlying agenda. During the course of their brief exchanges, Clara didn't ask about his business or make any attempt to flatter him. She never once commented on his wealth or success. She spoke to him like a person, not a billionaire, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he was being seen as more than just his net worth. He began to look forward to her visits, to the moments when she would quietly check on him, refilling his coffee without fuss, always offering a simple, "How's everything?" She didn't rush him, didn't push for a tip or try to impress him with grand gestures. Her quiet confidence, her grounded sense of self, had an effect on him that he couldn't quite explain. Over the next few weeks, Ethan returned to the diner regularly, each time sitting at the same counter, ordering the same meal, and each time finding himself drawn to Clara's calm, unwavering presence. One day, as he was finishing his meal, Clara stopped by his side with the check. "Is everything all right today?" she asked, her voice soft but sincere. Ethan, who had never let anyone into his life, found himself staring at her, his usual walls crumbling in her quiet company. It was in that moment that he realized he didn't want to be the man he had become, an isolated billionaire drowning in his own success. He didn't want to keep living a life dictated by others' expectations, a life devoid of real human connection. Clara, without knowing it, had shown him a different way of being. "I think I've been looking at life all wrong," he said, almost to himself. Clara smiled, not with the satisfaction of someone who had won a customer's admiration, but with the genuine understanding of someone who knew that change often started with small moments of connection. "It's not always about the big things," she replied. "Sometimes, it's the little things, doing what you love, treating people with respect, and just being present that can make all the difference." Ethan left the diner that day with a new perspective on life. He realized that success was not measured by how much money you made or how many people you could control. It was about the quality of the relationships you built and the peace you found within yourself. Clara's quiet confidence had shifted something deep inside him. She had unknowingly shown him that true wealth was not in possessions or power, but in human connection, kindness, and the ability to live authentically. Months later, Ethan returned to the diner, not as a billionaire seeking solace, but as a man who had learned to value the simple joys of life, like a quiet breakfast shared with people who cared. Clara's influence had changed him, and though she never knew it, she had altered the course of his life forever. James Aldridge had built his empire from nothing, rising from a humble background to become one of the wealthiest and most influential billionaires in the world. His company, a global tech giant, had revolutionized industries, making him a household name and a symbol of success. Yet, beneath the glossy surface of his achievements, James carried a burden of emptiness that he could never shake. His life, though filled with luxury and power, felt hollow. His relationships were superficial, and his days bled into each other without meaning or joy. He was a man who had everything, yet felt like he had nothing that truly mattered. One rainy afternoon, seeking refuge from the cold in a small, inconspicuous diner, James walked in without any fanfare. The place was nothing like the sleek restaurants he was accustomed to. The decor was worn, the tables a little crooked, and the air thick with the scent of comfort food. But it was exactly the kind of place where no one would recognize him, and for once, he welcomed the anonymity. As he sat down at the counter, he noticed a woman in her late 20s moving swiftly between tables, her tired eyes betraying the exhaustion she carried with her every day. Her name was Emily, and she had been working at the diner for years, ever since her father had fallen ill and her family needed extra income to cover medical bills. Life had not been kind to Emily, but she had never let the weight of her responsibilities crush her spirit. Her smile, though tired, was warm, and she always made her customers feel like they mattered, even if only for a moment. As she approached James's seat, her tiredness was evident in the way she walked, but her voice was clear and kind. "What can I get you today?" she asked, her tone professional, yet laced with a quiet compassion. James, who was used to being surrounded by people who either kissed up to him or feared him, felt an unexpected pang of discomfort. He looked up at Emily, noticing the gentle way she carried herself despite the hard life she led. "Just a coffee," he said, his voice gruff, not used to letting his guard down. Emily nodded and quickly went to fetch his order. As she returned with his coffee, their eyes met for a moment, and she saw something in his gaze, a hint of loneliness, of weariness, that she couldn't ignore. For a brief second, she hesitated, but then she set the cup down in front of him with a soft smile. "I hope it's a little warmer than the weather outside," she said, attempting to lighten the mood. James, who was used to people either treating him like royalty or avoiding him altogether, was surprised. There was no agenda in her words, no hidden motive. She wasn't trying to win his favor, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like a person, not a product. "Thanks," he said quietly, genuinely appreciative. Emily nodded and went back to work, but something about their brief exchange stayed with James. He watched her move through the diner, seeing how she interacted with the other customers, always patient, always kind, even when they were rude or demanding. It wasn't just her job, it was the way she seemed to genuinely care, like every person she served mattered. As the minutes passed, James found himself drawn into the simplicity of the moment, the ordinary, unpretentious world of the diner, a world so far removed from his own that it almost felt like a dream. After a while, he called Emily over again. She approached with the same professional yet warm demeanor. "Is everything all right?" she asked. James hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. How could he, a billionaire, confide in a waitress? Yet, there was something about Emily's presence that made him feel safe in a way he hadn't felt in years. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, his voice quieter now, "about all the things I built. The wealth, the company, the power. But I feel empty. Like none of it really matters." Emily's expression softened, and she sat down across from him, breaking the unspoken rule of customer-server distance. "I get that," she said, her voice steady, but with a hint of empathy that touched something deep inside James. "I've had to take on more than I ever thought I could. Life hasn't exactly given me a lot of breaks, but I've learned that, well, the little things matter the most. The people you help, the kindness you give, the way you show up every day even when it's hard." Her words weren't profound in the way books or motivational speeches often were, but they were real, genuine, grounded in the reality of a life lived with hardship and humility. James sat back, absorbing her words, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the walls he had built around himself begin to crumble. Emily had no idea who he was. She didn't know his name, his reputation, or the billions in his bank account, but she saw him as a person. A human being who was struggling, just like everyone else, and in that brief conversation, she reminded him of something he had long forgotten, that human connection, compassion, and empathy were worth more than all the wealth in the world. Over the next few weeks, James returned to the diner, sometimes to just sit quietly and drink coffee, other times to talk to Emily, who had become an unlikely catalyst for change in his life. With each visit, James found himself shedding layers of his former self, beginning to question the choices that had led him to his lonely, empty existence. He started to understand that success wasn't measured by stock prices or market shares, it was measured by the difference you made in the lives of others. Emily had no idea how deeply her simple acts of kindness were changing his world, but through her quiet empathy and her ability to see him as a human being, she had set him on a new path. A path where wealth no longer defined him, and where true success came from the connections he forged, the lives he touched, and the love he gave. That waitress, in her unassuming way, had changed everything for him. She had reminded him that sometimes, the most powerful catalysts for change aren't found in grand gestures or monumental decisions, they're found in the simple, quiet moments when someone sees you, truly sees you, for who you are. David Bennett had it all: a towering mansion in the hills, a fleet of luxury cars, and a business empire that stretched across the globe. A self-made billionaire, David had spent his life chasing success, his ambition driving him forward with relentless force. He believed that wealth was the answer to every problem, that power was the ultimate currency, and that happiness could be bought. But as the years went by, David found himself increasingly isolated. His marriage had crumbled under the weight of his ambition, his children had grown distant, and his friends were little more than business associates. In his mind, the more he achieved, the more he should have been fulfilled, yet the emptiness within him seemed to grow. One cold, gray morning, as David sat at his desk in his sprawling office, he received a letter, a small, unassuming envelope with no return address, the handwriting on the front unfamiliar. Curiosity piqued, he opened it, expecting a piece of fan mail or perhaps another business proposal. Instead, inside, he found a single note, handwritten with a simple yet powerful message: "I miss you, Dad. Please come home." It was from his daughter, Lily, whom he hadn't seen in over 2 years. David froze. The words hit him like a sudden blow, sharp and painful. He had known that his relationship with Lily had been strained, but he hadn't realized how far he had fallen from her life until that moment. The note wasn't a demand, nor was it an accusation. It was a quiet plea, a reminder of everything he had lost in his pursuit of success. The pain in those 4 words went deeper than any business failure or financial setback David had ever experienced. He sat motionless for what felt like an eternity, staring at the note, feeling the weight of his own choices, the hollow years of neglect, the years he had spent building an empire that had come at the cost of the people who mattered most. As the day wore on, David found himself unable to focus on work. Every meeting, every call, every email felt distant and insignificant compared to the emotional upheaval churning inside him. The image of Lily, now an adult, living her life without him, haunted him. He realized that despite all the wealth he had accumulated, despite the businesses and accolades, he had lost something far more precious: his connection to his daughter, to his family, to the simple joys of life. David tried to push the note aside, telling himself that he could handle it later, that he had responsibilities to meet, that his company needed him. But deep down, he knew that this moment had stopped him in his tracks for a reason. It wasn't just the letter, it was the realization that he had been running from something far more important than business or status. His life had become a series of transactions, of meetings and deadlines, and in the process, he had forgotten how to truly live. The guilt weighed heavily on him, suffocating his ability to move forward in the same way he had always done. He had been too focused on the future to realize that the most important thing in his life was already lost. That evening, after much internal struggle, David decided to take the most unexpected step of his life. He left the office early. For the first time in years, he turned off his phone, locked away his work, and drove to the small suburban house where Lily lived. His heart raced as he parked outside, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to even begin to repair the damage he had caused. As he stood there, staring at the house, David realized that the life he had been living had led him to this moment not because of his wealth, but because of his choices. He had been given a second chance, a fleeting opportunity to make things right. When Lily answered the door, her expression was a mixture of surprise and caution. David opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the note she had written to him, the same note that had stopped him in his tracks earlier that day. He handed it to her without saying a word, his eyes filled with the remorse and the regret he had carried for so long. Lily looked at the note, then back at him, her eyes searching his face for something she hadn't seen in years: sincerity, vulnerability, a sign that he was truly present. For a long moment, she didn't say anything, and David thought he had lost her for good. But then, with a quiet voice, Lily spoke. "I miss you too, Dad," she said. "But it's not just about the note. It's about showing up. It's about being here. You've missed so much of my life, but maybe we can start again." Tears welled in David's eyes, and in that moment, something inside him cracked wide open. He realized that success, wealth, and status were nothing without the love and connection he had sacrificed. That one simple note, an act of vulnerability from his daughter, had been the catalyst for his own transformation. It stopped him from continuing down a path that would have led him further into isolation and emptiness. The note didn't fix everything, but it was the beginning of something new: a second chance at rebuilding what mattered most. David knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in years, he had a direction: home. And as he embraced his daughter, he understood that true success wasn't about the empire he had built, but the relationships he had neglected, and now, the chance to rebuild them, one small step at a time.